The EFF agrees that we don't want undocumented people in South Africa. How can we say South Africans must get IDs and then welcome people who are not undocumented?
Julius Malema has once again said something on national television that has immediately sparked strong reactions across South Africa. Speaking on SAS, the EFF leader argued that South Africans are required to carry identification and be documented by the state, so it makes no sense, in his view, for undocumented foreign nationals to move freely inside the country without proper records. He said that if everyone is properly documented, then when crimes happen, people can be traced, investigated, and brought before the law. He also linked undocumented migration to rising public fears around crime, safety, and weak law enforcement. And as expected, those comments have now opened a much bigger national debate, because this issue is no longer just about Julius Malema. It is about identity, law, borders, unemployment, crime, public anger, political pressure, and the growing frustration of ordinary South Africans who feel that the system is not protecting them. At the same time, it is also about human dignity, fairness, and the danger of blaming every social problem on foreigners. So this is one of those conversations where emotions are high, facts matter, and politics becomes very explosive very quickly. Now, if we are being honest, Malema is speaking into a space where many South Africans are already deeply frustrated. Across townships, inner cities, informal settlements, and even rural communities, there has been a growing complaint that the state has lost control of immigration management. People are asking how undocumented individuals are able to enter, live, work, rent, trade, and in some cases even access services, while many citizens themselves struggle with paperwork, job opportunities, and state neglect. That anger has not appeared overnight. It has been building for years. To understand why this issue keeps coming back, you have to go back to South Africa's post-apartheid transition. After 1994, the country became a symbol of opportunity, freedom, and relative economic strength on the continent. People from across Africa and even beyond saw South Africa as a place where one could build a better life. Some came legally with work, asylum, or study documents. Others came through irregular channels, often escaping poverty, political instability, conflict, or economic collapse in their home countries. Over time, South Africa became not only a destination, but also a pressure point. And while migration itself is not unusual in any modern society, what made the South African situation more sensitive was the country's own internal crisis: massive unemployment, youth hopelessness, slow economic growth, crime, corruption, broken local government, weak border enforcement, overburdened policing, failing public services. When all of that exists at the same time, people start looking for someone to blame. And in many communities, undocumented foreigners became the easiest target. That is why this issue has repeatedly exploded into public anger over the years. We have seen anti-immigrant violence, shopliftings, intimidation campaigns, and political rhetoric becoming sharper and sharper. The conversation often moves very quickly from "we need lawful immigration control" to "foreigners are the problem," and that is where things become dangerous. Because once frustration loses discipline, it can turn into mob politics instead of policy. What Malema is doing now is tapping into that frustration, but framing it in a way that sounds administrative and lawful. He is not simply saying remove foreigners. He is arguing that everybody in the country must be documented and traceable. On the surface, that is actually a position many people would agree with. In fact, even many migrants themselves would agree with it, because undocumented people are often the most vulnerable to exploitation, police harassment, labor abuse, and criminal networks. If a person has no legal identity in the system, they are easier to use, easier to threaten, and harder to protect. So in one sense, Malema's argument lands with force because it speaks to a real weakness in the South African state. A country cannot run properly if it does not know who is entering, who is staying, who is working, and who is breaking the law. No serious country in the world can function like that for long. Documentation matters, border control matters, identity systems matter, crime tracking matters. That is not extremist language. That is basic state capacity. But here is where the issue becomes more complicated. Saying undocumented people must be identified is one thing, suggesting that undocumented foreigners are a central driver of crime is another. That is where public conversation often becomes too broad, too emotional, and too unfair, because not every undocumented person is a criminal, and not every criminal in South Africa is foreign. In fact, South Africa's crime crisis is deeply rooted in local social collapse, gang activity, policing failures, corruption inside law enforcement, poverty, and a justice system that often fails victims, regardless of who the suspect is. This is why the danger in political messaging is not always in what is said directly, but in what the public hears emotionally. When leaders repeatedly connect undocumented migration and crime, many listeners do not separate undocumented individuals involved in wrongdoing from foreigners in general. And once that line disappears, ordinary innocent people become targets simply because of how they speak, where they come from, or what passport they carry. That is why this debate must be handled with discipline. South Africans are absolutely justified in demanding secure borders, lawful immigration systems, and proper documentation. But they must also be careful not to fall into lazy scapegoating, because a broken state will always find it convenient when the public blames outsiders instead of demanding real governance. And this is where the politics becomes fascinating. Julius Malema knows exactly where public frustration is sitting right now. South Africa is entering a period where immigration, crime, sovereignty, and identity are becoming hotter election issues than before. Political parties know this. Communities know this. Social media definitely knows this. The language around who belongs, who is legal, and who is taking opportunities is becoming more central to political survival. So when Malema makes a statement like this, he is not just speaking morally or legally, he is positioning politically. The F has historically taken a more Pan-African tone in many of its ideological positions. Malema himself has often spoken about African unity, solidarity, and anti-colonial identity. That is why some people are now surprised by the sharpness of this argument. But in reality, what he is doing is not necessarily abandoning Pan-Africanism. He is trying to balance it with domestic public pressure. In other words, he is saying, yes, Africa is one, but a state still needs systems, records, and control. That is the lane he appears to be entering. Now compare that with how other political forces are handling this issue. Some groups speak far more aggressively and directly against foreign nationals, often using anger as a mobilizing tool. Others avoid the issue almost completely because they are afraid of being called xenophobic. And then there are those in government who admit the immigration system is broken but seem unable or unwilling to fix it in any meaningful way. That vacuum creates space for strong voices to dominate the conversation. And that may be the real reason this topic is becoming so powerful. People no longer trust the state to manage it quietly and competently. Once trust disappears, rhetoric fills the gap. If the government wanted to seriously deal with this issue, it would require more than speeches. It would need stronger and smarter border management, not just dramatic border photos. It would need faster and cleaner documentation systems. It would need proper cooperation between Home Affairs, SAPS, municipalities, and the courts. It would need to punish employers who knowingly exploit undocumented labor while undercutting citizens and legal migrants alike. It would need to separate refugees, asylum seekers, legal workers, undocumented migrants, and criminal actors properly instead of throwing everyone into one emotional basket. And above all, it would need to act consistently, because right now, many South Africans feel that the law is selective. They see ordinary people struggling to renew IDs, passports, permits, and paperwork, while at the same time they believe others are moving through the cracks of the system with ease. That creates resentment, whether the perception is fully accurate or not. And perception matters in politics almost as much as reality. At the same time, there is another uncomfortable truth here. Some undocumented networks do exist, and some are linked to illegal trade, trafficking, document fraud, and organized criminal activity. Pretending that this never happens would be dishonest. South Africans are not imagining every concern out of thin air. There are real cases, real border failures, and real criminal structures that exploit weak enforcement. So the answer cannot be denial. The answer has to be a lawful, targeted, evidence-based crackdown that focuses on criminality and administrative failure, not mob suspicion. That is the balance South Africa keeps failing to find. What Malema's comments have done is force the country back into that uncomfortable middle ground. On one side is the right of a sovereign state to know who is within its borders. On the other side is the need to protect innocent people from collective blame. Both things can be true at the same time. In fact, both must be true if the country wants a serious solution. Looking ahead, this issue is only going to get bigger as economic pressure rises, as jobs remain scarce, and as urban communities become more strained. Immigration politics will become more emotionally charged. More leaders will talk about it. More communities will organize around it. More arguments will happen online and on the ground. And unless the state finally produces a credible system, the conversation will become even uglier. So the real question is not whether South Africans have the right to demand order. They do. The real question is whether the country can pursue order without slipping into chaos, hatred, and political opportunism. That is the line South Africa now has to walk. And maybe that is why Malema's words hit as hard as they did. Because whether people agree with him or not, he touched a nerve that many politicians have been dancing around for too long. The public is tired, the public is angry, and the public wants answers. But answers built on emotion alone can create even bigger problems than the ones people are trying to solve. So now I want to hear from you. Was Julius Malema speaking hard truth on national television? Or was he opening the door to a more dangerous and divisive kind of politics? Do you believe undocumented migration is one of the biggest reasons behind crime and instability in South Africa? Or do you think politicians are using it as a convenient distraction from government failures? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is one of those debates South Africans can no longer avoid. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't forget to like and share. This conversation is far from over, and on this channel, we will keep breaking it down in simple, honest, and direct language. Until next time, stay informed, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.